The Southeast Asia Center at the University of Washington.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the talk presenting Pak Max Lane today. He's an author, he's a translator, he's an academic and activist as well. I was surprised when I read a journal website in Indonesia, and in the journal, Pak Max was interviewed by one of the kind of reporter or staff right there, and Pak Max mentioned that he joined Islamic Student Association. It was in 1970s, right?
I participated in one of their categorization courses.
All right. So, okay, that was really interesting to me. If yesterday Pak Max talked about Indonesia under Jokowi regime, today he is going to talk about Indonesia in the past, right? So, yeah, time is sometimes confusing. Yesterday he talked about Indonesia today, but today he's going to talk about Indonesia yesterday. So, yeah. Pak Max is the author of several books. I can't remember, so I have to read this one. Of Unvanished Nation, Indonesia Before and After Suharto, published by Verso, 2008. Catastrophe in Indonesia, published by University of Chicago, 2010. Decentralization and its Discontents, an essay on class, political agency and national perspective in Indonesian politics, published by ISEAS, Singapore, 2014. Indonesia Tidak Hadir di Bumi Manusia, published by Djaman Baru, 2017. And he just completed a new book, hopefully to be published in 2018. The title is The Politics of Indonesia's Trade Union Movement, an introductory essay. He's also the translator of the Penguin editions of Buru Tetralogy, the works that we are going to discuss today, which were written by Pramoedya Ananta Toer. So Pak Max is going to, tell us or share his experience with, working with Pramoedya Ananta Toer and reading his works, which is really important to better understand how Indonesia as a nation came into existence today, right? I don't want to spend too much time to talk, so please, Pak Max.
Okay, thank you, Will. Thank you, Celia, and thank you, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, for giving me this chance to speak here today. So I'm going to, as Will said, and as the publicity said also, of course, I'm going to be talking about Pramoedya Ananta Toer's work, in particular mostly about the Buru Quartet, Bumi Manusia, through to Footsteps, Bumi, This Earth of Mankind, Child of All Nations, Footsteps, and Glass, House of Glass, which of course is an enormous work, more than 1,000 pages. I've only got an hour, so I'm going to concentrate on a couple of things, or a few things. And the framework for that is or the starting point for that is going to be my general claim that a part of Pramoedya's genius that's reflected in these novels is that he's able to discover and present a grand narrative, a story of the origins of Indonesia. There's a lot of, especially in the United States, there are many articles now published about, in particular, This Earth of Mankind, and also House of Glass. But I think, and most concentrate on issues of class and gender and language, but I think in some ways the most important thing we need to know about, I think the most important thing that Pramoedya was able to present in those novels was a story about the creation of Indonesia. And as I said, basically, the story that produced in these 4 books, the historical novels written on Buru Island in prison, but researched in the years leading up to 1965, researched between 1959 and 1965, and then written from memory in prison on Buru Island. Although he did have quite a lot of other comrades in the prison who were also intellectuals, and he did use some of them as fact checkers. Here's the manuscript, did I get anything wrong? And other people in prison would help him, but they of course were also doing it from memory. These 4 novels are what I concentrated on, but I think many people, especially those who are familiar with the works in English, unfortunately are not aware that these 4 works, as a work presenting the origins of Indonesia, or presenting, well, Pramoedya himself called these 4 books the books about the Indonesian national awakening, but they're part of other books which try to trace the origins of Indonesia in the 20th century right back to the 9th and 10th century. And unfortunately, Arok, Dedes and Arus Balik, when the publication process shifted from Jakarta and Australia to the United States, the decision was not to translate Arok, Dedes, Arus Balik and the play Mangir, which cover the period from the 10th to the 18th century. So if you take these 7 books together, you've got basically an attempt to explain the historical processes that led to contemporary Indonesia from the 10th to the 10th century right through to the beginning of the 20th century. Arok Dedes is now available in English, published in Singapore. At the moment, unfortunately, it's out of print, but it will be. I'm just talking with publishers now about getting it reprinted. So hopefully, maybe next year, it will be in circulation again. Arus Balik, Pramoedya, just before he died, wrote me a letter asking me to translate Arus Balik as well, but I haven't been able to carry that out. I need a fellowship somewhere. For 6 months to a year till I'll do that, because it's a 900-page book, and it's a fantastic book, but it will require a major effort, a full-time effort to translate it. So as I said, Arok Dedes is translated now as Arok Java, out of print, and also the Chinese in Indonesia, Hokkien Indonesia, is also translated and out in English. But let's go back to Bumi Manusia and give a bit of a context, because I want to talk about this question of the origins of Indonesia and how it relates to the situation today. But we need a bit of context first. The books were published in the 1980s, 1981, after Pramoedya and 15,000 other political prisoners were released. In 1979, after 14 years in prison, he and his colleagues, Hashim Rahman, on this side here, on my left, far left, and on Yusuf Ishak on the right there, those 3 men established publishing company, Hasta Mitra. You can see it on the bottom of the book cover. They were all political prisoners. They established the publishing company, registered, etc., and then published their first book, Bumi Manusia, This Earth of Mankind, with up the top the words Roman novel, a novel written on Buru Island. So when they published that, just a few months, or they established the company just a few months after they got out of prison, and they published it just over a year after they got out of prison. This was quite a major act of defiance, because as former political prisoners, they were formally banned from being active in what was any sector of economic activity labelled as a vital sector, which included publishing. So they went ahead. They were really the only of the thousands of political prisoners that did something so public as this. They published the book. It was very well received in the press. All of the reviews in newspapers were very positive, extremely positive. And in this atmosphere of extremely positive responses to the books of this former political prisoner, one thing that sort of symbolises the atmosphere in the initial few months was that the vice president of Indonesia, Adam Malik, who's the third from the left, from my left, invited Pramoedya, Hashim Rahman and Yusuf Ishak, his two comrades, publisher comrades, to the vice presidential palace. They had a photo opportunity. This photo appeared on all the front pages of the Indonesian newspapers of the time. And Adam Malik made the statement that Bumi Manusia should be compulsory reading for all school children. Unfortunately, Adam Malik's sentiments weren't reflected elsewhere in the government, and a few months later the book was banned. But it had several months of legal circulation. After that was banned, it went into illegal circulation in photocopy form. But the publicity around it, including this photo op, meant that young people started to, especially university students, started to read it. And they were reading it at a time, 1980-81, which is very important in the history of the student movement in Indonesia. There were major student uprisings in 1974 and then again in 1978, but they were both defeated, and many student leaders were put in prison. And students were thinking, we had big movements in 1974 against Suharto. We had another big movement in 1978. We were defeated. Why? What's wrong with our perspective that we are so easily crushed? So it was a period, that was in 1978, 79, they went into jail. 1980, 81, students were thinking, what are we doing wrong? And a part of the process to find the answers to that question came through reading these four books. Bumi Manusia first, in Indonesian of course, and then over the next several years, the other three books came, and they were very, very widely read and studied by students. I would be not, I think I could quite justifiably say that every student leader on the left of centre in Indonesian politics during the 80s and 90s read these books and used them partly as a kind of guide to what you need to do to build a mass movement. Because volumes 3 and 4 talk about how mass movements were organised in the early 20th century. Everyone would have read them. Everyone who became active did read them. As I said, that's the first one. I just put these up here now just so people know that's how they're sold in Indonesia today. I'm not sure whether the ban on the books has been lifted or not. I did see briefly a report back in 1999 in a magazine called Detective and Romance, D&R, which had a small report stating from an official from the Attorney General's Department that the ban had been lifted. But that's the only mention publicly I've ever seen anywhere. So I don't know whether they're banned or not. But these books are on sale in all of the major bookshops in Indonesia and in all of the book kiosks that sell books in Indonesia, especially that are frequented by students. So it's important to know that they're still in circulation. They're still read today. There's been periods of when they've been not so much in circulation, then in circulation again. But in the last few years, these books, in this version, published by a publishing company, no longer the original publishing company, but a publishing company run by one of Pramoedya's daughters, they're very, very available. So, in terms of this idea of the creation story, or the origin story, I think one of the crucial things to note in these four novels is that one thing that's absent in Bumi Manusia, one thing that's absent in Anak Semua Bangsa, one thing that's absent in Footsteps, and one thing that's absent in House of Glass is Indonesia. Why is it absent? Well, because the books are historically accurate. That's why it's absent. Because in this period, the turn of the 20th century, the word Indonesia was not in circulation. The reason why the word Indonesia was not in circulation was because the idea of Indonesia was not in circulation. And the reason why the idea of Indonesia was not in circulation was that because all of the material components of the new thing that would be called Indonesia was still only at the point of conception, when things were just starting to come together and creating the chemical process, if you like, or the socio-chemical process that eventually created the new, real, actually existing material phenomenon that a community that was gradually being formed and later became called Indonesia. Although Pramoedya, after Suharto fell, joined a political party. He joined the People's Democratic Party, and there's a big public ceremony where he was sworn in as a member. And in his speech at that swearing in front of several hundred people, more actually, he said, in his opinion, the founding fathers of Indonesia gave Indonesia an incorrect name. He said Indonesia means the islands of India. The literal meaning is the islands of India, and Indonesia has nothing to do with India. It's a completely wrong name and should be changed. The better name would be either Nusantara or Dipantara. So we're talking about a period where Indonesia, it's not there, it's absent. And I think at one level that's just part of the objective fact that the idea was not there, the word was not there, and the ingredients that were to make up Indonesia were just starting to mix together. But I think it was also something that Pramoedya was conscious about in the way he chose to write the novel. The novel is told through the first-person voice of the character Minke, or Minke. That is to say, a voice of an actual existing person in that era. So the story is told from within the era. It's not told by somebody looking back later on, which was another narrative format which Pramoedya could have chose. He could have chose someone 1920s or 1930s from a later period looking back, telling what was happening, in which case the word Indonesia might have appeared, because the narrator would have come from that era when the word Indonesia was appearing. But Pramoedya chose to embed the story within the era, meaning you can read the whole four novels, which according to Pramoedya himself is about the national awakening of Indonesia, without Indonesia being there. And I think this is extremely important thing to understand, and I think indirectly and sometimes unconsciously it's one of the things that has a big impact on Indonesian readers. Because the implication is, of course, that Indonesia is something totally new. Indonesians are something totally new. At the time the story is told, Indonesia does not, there is no such thing as an Indonesian person. There are only Javanese and Sundanese and Balinese, etc. There's no such thing as an Indonesian at the time the story takes place, at the beginning of the 20th century. The story is about how this thing starts, the very beginning of how this thing starts coming to being, how a new consciousness starts to be formed, the very, very early origins of this consciousness being formed. And I think the approach Pramoedya uses is summed up in this quote here, is the whole four novels are trying to describe being, life, the empirical development and manifestation of life of different individuals. He wants to get not so much the nitty-gritty, but the reality of cause and effect that's taking place on so many fronts. He wants to describe the conditions of the world. And I think the four novels, they're sort of divided into two. This Earth of Mankind and Anak Semua Bangsa, which are written through Minky's voice as a teenager and very young man, are basically primarily concerned about depicting these social conditions of existence, all the factors impinging on and helping form Minky's consciousness, Annalie's consciousness, Nyai Ananta Toer, another major, all the individual characters' consciousnesses, and minor characters too. The first proletarian is described in This Earth of Mankind. The young woman who works on the dairy farm milking the cows. If you look at that, that's a worker, different from the other characters. So all the different sort of social roles that the new society is forming, the colonial capitalist, the sugar capitalist, the peasant girl who becomes a concubine, Sanakam who becomes Nyai Ananta Toer, who then becomes herself an entrepreneur, the aristocracy, the mother and father, all of the colonial intellectuals, all of the characters are there who have roles in the colonial system and the new social conditions which are being produced. And it's all the depiction how things happening in the economic world, political world, and characters all interacting, and how characters interact, and how that network of enmeshed interactions actually defines reality. Footsteps and House of Glass also continue this process of describing the social conditions, but they're also very interested in describing agency, how organizations formed, what the strategies of organizations were, how the political movement to create an independent nation, the very early origins of that. So there are two processes. There's the social processes flowing out of the economic conditions, and there's the political movement that starts to develop. It's described when Minky, based on the character, the historical figure Raden Mas Tirto Adisuryo, establishes the Syarikat Dagang Islam, or helps establish the Syarikat Perai, and then after that the Syarikat Dagang Islam, and how that starts to play a role in politics. And I think this whole process, one of the important aspects of this whole process is also built around the character of Minky. And I think one of the things also that I haven't really seen many people mention, but which I think is very important in the novels, is to understand that in This Earth of Mankind in particular, and in Anak Semua Bangsa, not in Footsteps, but in This Earth of Mankind and Anak Semua Bangsa, there are two Minkys. Not one, there are two Minkys. Which is making it very hard for film producers to make film out of it. Because if you don't understand that, presenting it on screen is going to be very difficult. Who are the two Minkys? Well, there's the Minky there is the Minky who is the young high school student, still finding his way towards a more mature state, still with the eyes for the pretty girls by the sound of it, and in reality actually, who's quickly impressed by this powerful woman, Nyai Ananta Toer, impressed also in a different way by her daughter. But there's a second Minky. It's the Minky who's telling the story. The Minky because the novel is written in the first person voice. So Minky is telling the story about himself. But the maturity that's embodied in the writing, the maturity that's embodied in explaining everything that happened to the young Minky, that's the voice of the mature Minky. That's the voice of the Minky who wrote Footsteps, the third volume. In This Earth of Mankind, there are two Minkys. And that's also extremely important in the whole how did this Minky, with his consciousness and all its qualities, develop? And I think this also describes the best approach to understand how these characters like Minky go. In a normal way of assessing a novel, you might say, well, Minky goes from a young, immature man to a mature person. But there's more to it than that. He goes from being a young Javanese facing these new conditions to somebody who's almost an Indonesian. He's at the verge of becoming an Indonesian. So the process of describing how Minky develops as a human being from a young teenager to the man who helped found Syarikat Dagang Islam, which is in Jejak Langkah, and then from a different angle in House of Glass, and who established a newspaper, who established with his wife the first women's magazine in Indonesia, etc., etc., etc. That process is not just the process of a young man to a more mature man, but from Indonesia not being, from Indonesia being absent, to Indonesia being at the just on the verge, the ambang, just on the verge of opening the door, entering into the stage that is Indonesia. You know, those who read Footsteps will remember Minka's heard all sorts of, starts to hear different ideas about self-government from his teacher and from others of self-government. And his own newspaper, the tagline is, Medan Priayi is the name of the newspaper. The tagline is the voice of the governed. So if the governed are going to self-govern, who are the governed? Who exactly are the governed? There's no concept of an Indonesian nation. There's just a concept of the governed. And at the end of Jejak Langkah, Minka thinks, well, I'm going to travel around to all those areas where there are people who speak Malay. And maybe there'll be a common enough basis in be able to discuss things to work out this question of, is the governed a community? Is there a community of the governed with set borders that can be something? Still, a nation, still not quite there. And I think in the development of the Minky character, I think this thing of how Minky's development is not driven by, he doesn't have an image of what some future Indonesia. It's not driven by something that's, some idea that he's moving towards. He's driven by all the factors in real life that push him here, that push him there, that make him think this, then that make him think that. He's not driven by a goal, except to be a free human being. He's driven by all these elements, and he moves from being someone, because the way the typical Javanese, like his father in the novel, his father, the Bupati, is depicted, very narrow-minded, Java, parochial Javanese narrow. Minka goes out of that. And of course, in the second novel, Pramoedya gives the second novel's title, Child of All Nations, which even indicates that Indonesia itself is going to be something which, in and of itself, cannot be narrow-minded. It's a child of all nations. Now, also in the novel, as a part of this depiction of this process, I think there are also some quite profound assessments of the historical process relating to agency. Pramoedya also wrote this book, Sang Pemula. This is a picture of Tirto Adisuryo, the character that inspired the Minky, rather than Mas Minky or Minky, a real historical figure. He wrote this book. It comprises some of the writings of Tirto Adisuryo himself, plus introduction by Pramoedya. And of course, there's two aspects to what Tirto Adisuryo does. One is he's a publisher, a writer, a journalist, So the whole role of writing, of texts in this process of nation formation is very present in Pramoedya's books. But he's also a figure representing a class. He's representing the incipient Indonesian bourgeoisie. In fact, Nyai Antasoro, as a successful entrepreneur, is also representing, the early local bourgeoisie, not Dutch or English or French, not Chinese, but local. Because that was a new thing. Prior to the beginning of the 20th century, most of the local elites were descendants of the aristocracy working for the Dutch, in the Dutch administrative system. There was no real significant local bourgeoisie at all, very different from the Philippines, where the hacienda culture going back a couple of hundred years produces well-resourced bourgeois figures even in the 19th century. Indonesia, no. But I think, and it's this class, through a figure like Tidak di Suryo, which motivates the spreading of the language, telling of, and the role of story in this whole thing, because a part of Pramoedya's assessment of the spread of the Malay language is that not that it was used as a lingua franca, not that it was used as an administrative language by the Dutch, but that it was used initially by Chinese and Eurasians and then by people like Suharto to tell stories about those contemporary conditions of the world. Detective stories, romance stories, but set in this new society that was emerging, in particular in the urban centres. So he's presenting a picture where individuals from this bourgeoisie are key to the agency. And I think there's also, because in his book Arok Dedes, he starts to also lay the basis for describing how caste in Hindu Java worked. And I think he thinks, I know he thinks, because we also talked about this, that he thinks the feudal past also left a legacy of an ongoing presence of caste. Because the caste and class here, we're talking in a more or less Marxist type framework. Class is defined by your relationship to the means of production, whether you own means of production, whether you own capital or not. Caste is more a question of where you sit in a hierarchy of function. The Brahmin have a certain function, Kshatriya, the armed layer, has a certain function, Vaishya, traders have a certain function. It's defined by your function, and the caste sets a particular function at a particular level of hierarchy. And I think he thought he's depicting a situation where there's a legacy of caste, that is, there's a new caste, sort of, Priyayi class, the lower aristocracy who work for the Dutch, who functionally have the function of administering power for the Dutch, and they also have this quite high hierarchy. And he depicts this because in trying to work out how class and agency becomes organised as a political force, he tells a story which basically he uncovered, because the Dutch histories didn't give much focus to this at all, and Dutch histories were the ones used for most of the 20th century, really, of this period. Tells a story how he thought, well, we have to organise to counter the Dutch, not to overthrow the Dutch, but to counter the Dutch. We need an organisation that will be the voice of the governed. Who? Well, this is the era of modern knowledge. We have to have people who are well educated with formal schooling. Who are they? They are the local people, the Pribumi, the natives, who have Dutch high school schooling, Who are they? They are the ones who work for the Dutch, because the only people who got access to that were people who were candidates to work for the Dutch. So let's organise them, the Priai. And his first organisation that he establishes with other people, he plays the central role, is Syarikat Priai, the Union of Priais. So Medan Priai was his newspaper, and Syarikat Priai was the organisation. But Syarikat Priai failed. He discovered that while these people were educated, their dependence on Dutch power for their livelihood meant that in the end, as time went on, they just weren't going to be the agency to confront Dutch power. So that collapsed. Then I think another unique contribution of Pramoedya is the way he describes the thinking of someone like Tirta Adisuriyo in the formation of the Syarikat Dagang Islam, Indonesian Traders Association. Because he has a different, the traditional Dutch history text taken over by most Indonesian history texts is that Syarikat Dagang Islam was primarily formed to defend local merchants against competition from Chinese. That's the most common story you hear. What Pramoedya is saying is, well, there was more to it than that. Tirta Adisuriyo, who helped found Syarikat Dagang Islam, was also motivated by his analysis as to why the educated Priai were hopeless as political agents for change. They were hopeless because they were dependent on Dutch power. So he asked the question, who was not dependent on Dutch power? The people who were not dependent on Dutch power are the people who tried to earn their living independently. As orang merdeka, free people, not makan gaji, not just eating the salary from the Dutch. So for him, the word dagang did not just mean pedagang, merchants who sold, but anyone who strived to earn their living independently of the Dutch colonial state. So for him, Syarikat, there was the Priai caste, and sometimes if you hear Pramoedya talk or in some of his short speeches, he will talk about Brahmin intelligentsia, and if you read Arok Dedes, I think there's a whole chapter where a bunch of Brahmin are talking to each other. I don't know, with all due respect to all us academics, I have a suspicion he's talking about the alienation of academic intellectual life from reality. There's a Brahmin, and then there's Kshatriya, the armed, with all due respect to the armed forces, the thugs, the armed thugs, he classified them as the Kshatriya, and then the Vaishya, the merchants. So he's looking at, there's a shift from kind of class, or is it class or is it caste? But I think he's moving into the assessment of, what was happening in Holland was no longer simply a caste, but more a caste. So Nyai Toer is owner of property. Tirta Adisuriyo becomes the owner of property. And so that's the beginners. Sang Pemula, if you remember, Sang Pemula, the pioneer. So the pioneer comes from the bourgeoisie, but his depiction through to the four novels is that this early bourgeoisie in Indonesia is not up to the task either. Minka is exiled. No, don't want to give too many spoilers, but I have to. He's exiled, he comes back, and in House of Glass, he's killed, and there's nothing much left of what he did. He's a pioneer. He was very successful in Pramoedya's eyes as a starter, as a beginner, as someone who started the process, who got things going. But he wasn't somebody, and his class wasn't a class that was able to continue with things onwards and complete the tasks. Rather, in House of Glass, Footsteps, and even more in House of Glass, when both those, he starts to give hints that there may have to be another agency. So you start to get figures like Simone, who later became a leader of the Indonesian Communist Party. Haji Miswak, one of the early Marxist Islamic Islamic preachers. A different class and different kind of people might need to take over the role of finishing the tasks that the pioneers began. And I think that's also a quite important contribution to the understanding of what actually did happen in the next phase. Because in the next phase, the Sarekat Dagang Islam becomes the Sarekat Islam and grows to a huge organization, probably the biggest mass organization anywhere in the world at the time. And then it splits, and its most dynamic sector, the Sarekat Rakyat, becomes the Indonesian Communist Party. So, because we know what's happened, because Pramoedya knew what happened, his hints about Semaun and Haji Misbak were not just fantasies, but they were also inspired by what actually happened in the next area. So, oops, which way do you press it? Haji Miswak emerges, Marcos, who was also a left-wing writer and activist, Semaun, all these figures start to get a role, start to emerge in the last two volumes. I think hinting at that there's going to be some other agency, not the class from which Tito Adesua become, or Nyayan Tosoro. Nyayan Tosoro also is on. She doesn't come from a capitalist class. She's a young woman who basically sold by her parents to a Dutch plantation owner, or Dutch dairy farm owner and plantation worker, but plantation manager. But she becomes one. Of course, she also is a failure. She's a big success in helping form Minka's understanding of the New World. But she's only herself able to survive in the end by migrating to France, marrying a Frenchman and migrating to France. She's not able to grow and develop in the Dutch East Indies itself. So there's the hint that maybe another class, and the only other class really available is the proletariat and the peasantry. Maybe he's hinting, I think he is hinting that they're going to have to take on that task. And of course, we know later, by the late 1920s, Sukarno also invented his own term for the non-priai, bourgeois sections of society, the Marheim. Of course, we know also that as time progressed, we saw in the period after Maidan Priai, we saw a movement develop where not only the text and newspapers became important, but organising. This, of course, the photos from that era are not very good, but this is a photo of a typical mass rally in the 1920s. Forgathering, called Forgathering, which was a huge phenomenon. There's an Indonesian woman, I think, one of the East Coast American universities, just completing a thesis on this now. These mass rallies in the 1920s were an enormous phenomenon. They could be quite small, 10 or 20 people, but also quite huge as well. The Dutch often banned them because when it looked like they're getting out of hand. And even when they weren't banned, there's always Dutch officials sitting at the back, ready to stop it at any moment. And that's when what was written in Malay or Indonesian by that time was read out. So the role of the text was not through people reading it directly, but it being read out and discussed, because most people in this period were still illiterate. So today, I think in the 1980s, part of the impact was if you talk to young people who read it, and even some not young people who read it, they were exhilarated. because the whole story of change, of so many factors becoming involved, of people being motivated by wanting to resist all the negative aspects of colonialism, resist injustice, think how to fight. The Dutch had to start an organisation, what language you had to speak in. I think in many ways, for many readers, it was actually discovering Indonesia. And I'm in the middle of writing something now where I'm going to argue that when all those writers and activists in 1965 were exiled, what was actually exiled was Indonesia. And when the books came back from Buru Island, what was coming back from exile was in fact Indonesia. So when people read it, when some of the Indonesians read it, especially in the 1980s, they were discovering an Indonesia which they had never felt existed before. But it also, in two different ways, brought alive an awareness among some of the young readers of the role of class in two ways. One, in the actual stories, the story of what happened, the formation of Circa, why it failed, which is essentially for a class reason, why you chose Circa Dagang Islam, and then what problems it faced, which are explained in Jejak Langkah, in Footsteps and House of Glass, and what class might be playing a role in the next phase, or what class should be playing a role in the next phase. That was one thing, and that was a very important thing for students at the time in 1980, 81, 82, because the conclusion was the student movement in 1974 and 1978 failed because it was a movement for change made up only by students. So the next generation of students said, no, we have to get involved with workers, factory workers, we have to get involved with farmers. So by the end of the 1980s, you can see, if you trace the continuity of student activists, you can see those who continue on now trying to set up trade unions in the late 80s, trying to set up trade unions, trying to set up peasant organisations, because that was one of the conclusions out of their own assessment of the student movement, and it was impacted greatly, was pushed along by Pramoedya's books. So there was a second important reason for this, because the Bumi Manusia, This Earth of Mankind, really was really subverted, really challenged the regime's 15-year-old propaganda or labelling of what the pre-1965 left was like. So people might be familiar. I mean, what's manifested this, symbolised this most of all, was the ugly black propaganda against alleged communist women who danced naked and tortured generals. So that was part of the general way you pictured the Communist Party. They were evil and inhumane. They were ugly and low-life. But then you read This Earth of Mankind, and people ask the question, well, this is a book written by an evil communist who had to be exiled to Buru Island. But does it read like a book like that? And most, and even some people in the elite, and even some people in the prosecutor's office, whom I met, it's not a book like that. It's a book full of humanity. So for a lot of the readers, maybe what they said, the young readers, what they told us about the people who are on Buru Island is wrong. Maybe they're not ugly, atheistic, murderous, torturing people like that, like communists were depicted. So this is 1980-81, there are 15,000 former political prisoners in society. So some young people start to search them out and meet them and talk with them. And of course they hear versions of history and analysis of politics which are very different from what had been hegemonic from 1965 until 1980. And so class also, through those discussions, becomes a more significant factor. Now today, I think there's two phenomena you start to find even from a few years ago, and including even amongst factory workers, Pramoedya reading groups. Factory workers who gather together and read page by page Bumi, Manusia, other novels, discussing what it means. What are the values in it? Pramoedya himself, I think, saw the values as being essentially, values consistent with what came out of the European Enlightenment. And he always used to say that Indonesians did not learn enough from the West, except for the hypocrisy. So in the contemporary situation, you start to get these reading groups, more discussion of the agencies. But I think even in the last couple of years, just go through here. In the last couple of years, I think you start to see an increased interest in Pramoedya's work. But it's complicated. On the one hand, I think amongst the young people you get increased interest. I'll just flip forward here a bit. You get books like this, The Wisdom of Pramoedya Ananta Toer. It's an English title, but it's in an Indonesian book. Basically comprises compendium of quotes from Pramoedya, plus a collection of his essays and speeches that he gave since his release from prison. That's my little new book, just released a couple of months ago, with also looking at the content of what Pramoedya said about history and politics. But you can also see, T-shirts. This is just a small selection of T-shirts out now that feature Pramoedya on them, which I don't want to exaggerate here. It's not like there are millions of students now wearing Pramoedya T-shirts. Still a minority, but you can see the process happening. This wasn't there a while ago, now it is. And I think these sorts of books and interest in reading Pramoedya, and there are others as well, and articles as well, reflect this increased interest. And I think it's connected to a process of regeneration, but it's complicated because young people read Pramoedya, and it presents them with a very different set of values than what they get at school or from mainstream culture and propaganda. But of course, there's also, they're not books which help you solve some major questions, because they're books about they're books about the origin of Indonesia. But weirdly, there are books about the origins of an Indonesia which perhaps doesn't really exist anymore. Because there's a second Indonesia, the one created after 1965. Pramoedya himself, because I met him quite often, and my own personal assessment is that in some ways he hardly recognized the country he was released into as Indonesia. And he really grappled to, what is this? I mean, if you'd been active in the 30s and the 40s, fighting against the Dutch, Merdeka, struggling for freedom, and then now that we have a free country, what's it going to be? That semangat, that spirit. We struggled hard, people died, went to prison, kicked out the Dutch, now we have our own country, what are we going to make of it? That whole spirit of that 1940s, 1950s, up until 1965, disappeared. How many young Indonesians now are motivated by a spirit, we are going to make something of Indonesia in the future? No, it's Tidak, not there. Not that kind of fighting revolutionary spirit that Pramoedya knew, and which Pramoedya saw in embryo at the beginning of the 20th century. So he talks about the beginning of the 20th century. What about the contemporary? What about the post-65 Indonesia? What explains that? And I think that's his basic limitation, and the limitation of his generation. Of course, much of his generation on the left were killed, so you could say some of the intellectual leaders are not there to explain what happened, to assess what happened. But even those who are have not produced, I think, any self-criticism or critique of their own generation's history. I think, as I said right at the beginning, Pramoedya is a genius in explaining the origins, the moments of conception that started the socio-chemical process that produced Indonesia. But what of his own generation? The generation that won independence, that struggled over what Indonesia would be like up until 1965, and then that process ended. And you now have what is Indonesia today. And the gap is quite huge. And Pramoedya said, when are you going to write about that period? He said, I can't. I've got writer's block. That's what he wrote. I've got writer's block. I can't. When can you? The whole era has to finish first, which I think is an excuse. But at least he did also say, all these questions, don't ask my generation at all. We've had it. We can't contribute anything anymore. The young generation is going to have to work out all these answers. So I think that's the limitation of Pramoedya's main limitation in looking at the whole history of Indonesia, that unable to critique the history of his own generation. But I think if Pramoedya had a writer's block, in some ways we could also say that the countries had a writer's block. And I think in my talk yesterday, talking about how the taboo was linked, the taboo about talking about 1965, which is the moment at which the current Indonesia comes into existence, the taboo about discussing alternative versions of what happened in 1965, the erosion of that taboo is an erosion of the national writer's block. The inability to assess history, which is partly a function of the state for 33 years, the state enforcing in a very totalitarian way only one version of history. I mean, all societies, Australia, United States, promote a specific version of history, but they don't totalitarianly enforce it. United States, I know you have a mainstream version of history, but even for a long time, you can still easily buy books by someone like Howard Zinn. In Indonesia, no Howard Zinns. The first Howard Zinn to arrive, the one and only Howard Zinn to arrive, is Pramoedya's books about the beginning of the 20th century. So it was a state-enforced totalitarian single view of history, creating a national writer's block. But I think that's also ending, which is what I discussed yesterday. There are many, the activities in art and theatre, and you can see one manifestation of this process in theatre if you come to the screening of Pfizer's play tomorrow, the Silent Song of the Genje Flowers. But there are it's one of the most powerful. There are others as well. Also contribution by foreign academics. UCLA history professor Jeffrey Robinson has a book coming out next year, The Killing Season, a history of the Indonesian massacres, 1965-66. And an Australian historian, Jess Melvin, young historian, is also having a book coming out next year, The Indonesian Army and the Army and the Indonesian Genocide, which actually will be even more explosive than Jeffrey Robinson's book, because it's most of its history of what happened is based on Indonesian Army intelligence documents. So it tells the story of what happened from inside the army. She was able to get access to a huge number of Indonesian Army intelligence documents in one of the regions of Indonesia, and she's able to show how the mass killings were indeed directed from Jakarta by the military in a systematic manner. She has all the internal army documents to prove that. So that, I think, Soon the national writers' block might end, and as that happens, history will become one of the most political issues in the country. Ending the state-enforced totalitarian single version of history is in many ways one of the most fundamental aspects of bringing about or giving more substance to actual democracy in Indonesia. Because you ask the question, can you actually have a democratic scenario, democratic conditions, if you're not allowed to say, no, that's not what happened, but this happened? While you can't say that either legally or because the taboo is too strong, democracy itself is fragile, and that's why all the most anti-democratic forces in Indonesia react to any discussion of other versions of history as as democracy taken too far and wanting to go back to authoritarian. And I think while this atmosphere continues of around the issue of history, Pramoedya's books will continue to be read, because I think in terms of radical politics in Indonesia, which is connected to this whole process, the emergence of new, more radical, in the sense of left-wing groups, re-winning the country's history and the legacy of struggle from the beginning of the 20th century, re-winning that whole history in the sense of understanding it and being able to learn the lessons from it and so on, is going to be a crucial part of any evolution of a radical or progressive kind of politics in the next period. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. I think we have some time for some questions. Sean?
Dr. Lee, thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. My name is Sharon. I am a fourth-year PhD student in history department. I work with Laurie. And I work on Islamic socialism, so I was actually really happy to hear you mention Hadir and all these characters, Seagull, very big part of my dissertation. I have one brief comment and then two questions. Maybe we can address the second one later more informally. So the brief comment is, I've actually come across quite a bit of stuff in Reformasi era publications, which I feel actually do sort of challenge the hegemonic consensus on Indonesian history. And probably the best example I can think of is Hesri Setiawan's Negara Maduin. And I thought that was a really good book that saw in Indonesian, published in Indonesian by LKIS, I think, that forces a reconsideration of Maduin, which is one of those ugly moments in a revolution when the revolution consumes itself, right? And besides that, there's people who write about Syarifudin Pramoedya Ananta Toer, talk about him as an Islamic socialist, really interesting stuff that I use in my own research. And I feel that many of these people are sort of counterparts or descendants of Pramoedya's work, and they sort of continue a fine tradition of challenging and reinterpreting history in Indonesia. So that was the brief comment. My question is going to be a rambling one, and please bear with me for a minute. I've been working on my perspectives lately, so reading, Anderson in Imagined Communities, puts forward this argument about print capitalism, which everyone I'm sure is familiar with. And Medan Priyayi is obviously one example of that print capitalism that makes possible Indonesia, right? James Seagull in Fetish Recognition Revolution talks about the importance of translating the world to Indonesia and all the mechanisms and dynamics of that translation. And listening to you talk about the Buru Quartet, I wondered if, here's what I want to hear your input on. I wondered if you thought that the Buru Quartet was an example of print capitalism as well, but in a slightly different way. Rather than making possible a new nation called Indonesia, it strengthened the sense of nationness that was Indonesia, but it also made possible, it was one of the conditions of possibility for the formation of, or reconfiguration of Indonesia, that was not the stasis of the Orde Baru. I think Pemberton on the subject of Djaman calls Orde Baru Indonesia as he describes it as a kind of fetishization of order, and it's constantly on its guard for any disruptions to that order. It sounds a lot like Dutch colonialism, right? It sounds very allegorically appropriate. I was wondering if you thought that this Buru Quartet made possible like a new kind of Indonesia that would go beyond the authoritarian Suharto regime, and whether in sort of translating Indonesia to the world, right? Because this got a lot of international recognition, that also helped facilitated the process of the new Indonesia. And I say this because I'm from Singapore, and we have very little touchstones like to root our culture in. That's why I'm so obsessed with food, because we don't really have anything else. And one of the things I've noticed in recent years that has helped Singaporean identity coalesce a little more, at least for some people, including myself, is artistic and literary production. So plays by Alfian Sa'ad, films by Eric Koo and Lucian Feng, these are things that get international recognition. These seem to have helped my society to move forward a little bit in terms of coalescing its identity and configuring what it wants to be beyond Lee Kuan Yew. And I was wondering whether you see the Buru Quartet as a kind of national epic in that sense, a new national epic, so not like the Ramayana, but analogous, right? That the national epic fit for the new Indonesia that helps make possible new configurations of Indonesian identity. Sorry, I know that was a really, really long question.
In my book Unfinished Nation, the last chapter of the English version, because the Indonesian version has 3 new chapters, but in the English version is I forget the exact title, but it has in the words "Back to the Future," because I think I think if anything develops, which is a challenge to the Indonesia that's evolved since 1965, it will have a significant component of, as I said just a minute ago, re-winning some of the revolutionary and some of the ideas about change, some of the values that were part of the first few decades of the 20th century, when the Indonesian nationalist movement developed, but more significantly where the Indonesian where a community developed that would become the Indonesian nation. So I think there will of necessity, I think, be a re-winning of some of that, informing something that's new. Whether that's something which new actually occurs, of course, is going to be a question of political struggle and who wins the political struggle and how that evolves. So I don't know what the outcome will be, but as a person, I personally would be supporting, that direction. But who knows how that will actually evolve? So I think the Buru Quartet, and especially if you include with it Arok, Dedes, and Arus Balik and Mangir, because This Earth of Mankind, Bumi Manusia, and the others are the ones who are most frequently read, but gradually the others are being read also. I think that whole 7 books history will record that it has played and will play a big role in helping define or helping people reconstitute something new. But I think we have to see it. I think we have to see we have to reapply again the process that's described. This is from Marx's German ideology, where he's looking at how to understand the emergences of consciousness and so on. I think this approach, which is a much more materialist approach, is far superior to, say, the Andersonian imagined communities approach, which I basically see as a disguised form of Orientalism, where someone tries to capture the essence of something via the text. You uncover the code that's embedded in a text, and because you have the expertise to uncover that code, you can understand the society that's somehow what's the word? A holograph, is that the word, holograph? that pops out of the text. Whereas instead of starting from the text, this approach is to start from documenting and understanding all of the material processes taking place. So I think print capitalism itself actually obscures what happens, because it's true, of course, that in the beginning of the 20th century and the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century in the Dutch East Indies, newspapers played a big role. But ironically, in the end, the role they played was not as if you think of capitalism, produces commodities, and newspaper is one of these commodities and so on. Actually, the written text played less of a role in the context of capitalism and more a role in the context of the emerging mass organizations. Often when you read about print capitalism, the role of newspapers, often one image which is often quoted or used is, you can imagine people all around the Dutch East Indies sitting at a coffee table reading the newspaper while drinking their coffee. No, it's not like that. First of all, only a minuscule number of people were literate. Newspapers were read out in the front of mass meetings. Mass meetings could only take place once organisation started. And people were only interested in hearing what the reports in newspapers in those mass meetings organised by organisations because there was movement. People wanted change. People wanted things to move. So I think the whole concept of print capitalism is too static and implicitly oriented around commodities, and less and gives insufficient weight to organisation, movement, and material reality. Which is why I think in Anderson's book, he also rejects the analysis provided by Tom Nairn, who wrote about Scottish nationalism. Anderson explicitly states Nairn's idea that the masses played a role in the formation of nations is wrong. And that's an explicit statement he makes. Whereas Nairn argued that masses did play a very important, he talks about Scottish nationalism, did play a very important role insofar as disenchanted middle classes and elites channeled their energies. So Nairn didn't argue that masses led the process of creating of nations, but that their energy and participation was essential. And I think that's also what that's why, there's a big overlap in some respects with what Pramoedya writes in his novels and the role of newspapers and text and maps, etc., that Anderson talks about. But in Jejak Langkah and Makacha, where you get the rise of organisation, Syarikat Dagang Islam, and that becomes, and the newspaper becomes, there's a nexus between the newspaper, Medan Priyayi, and organisation. And figures like Marco and Semaun start to get involved in this nexus. Pramoedya's picture is it's not just the text somehow holographing reality into existence. It's real people involved in organisation for movement. So I think that's, that kind of framework is necessary. And I think, therefore, in terms of your question about the future, I think the texts, these books history will note these texts played a role. But you're going to have to see how these texts actually, what the nexus is between these texts and objective changes taking place and organisation and agency. The texts don't have an impact by themselves or just because people read them. There's going to be other mechanisms and processes where there's an actual agency and social force and material processes all meshing together to bring about something different.
Thank you, that's great.
Singapore is also, we can talk about Singapore separately.
Yeah.
Singapore is also I think you're wrong on Singapore, by the way. In Singapore, you have the same issue. You have a rich history before the 60s.
Yeah.
And for something different to happen in Singapore, you also have to re-win that rich history which nobody knows anymore, or very few people know anymore. But at least there's some, there's some chipping away at the single view of history in Singapore also, which is almost as severely enforced in Singapore as it was in Indonesia.
Yeah.
There's some chipping away, but there's not as much chipping away in Singapore as there is today in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Could you talk more about the term Indonesia that is absent in Pramoedya's Buru Tetralogy? I mean, I believe he read so many historical books, archives, so on and so forth, and why he kind of missed the Sumpah Pemuda 1928, which clearly stated the word Indonesia at that time. So
The four novels end about 1918. So the 1918, 1919, 1920s, the four novels finish about then. So in the period from 1900 or 1890s to 1920, no Indonesia. So the use of the word Indonesia begins, around 1920 onwards. So by 1928, yes, Sumpah Pemuda, Indonesia is used. But in the period of when Minka was alive, Tito Adisurio was active. Up until basically, he was active up until towards the end of World War I, 1917, 1918. During that period, no, Indonesia is not. And then even when it was first occasionally used, it was used in Europe by German and English anthropologists, not in Indonesia. So it starts to be used by Indonesians, or by Indonesians to be, because are they already Indonesians or not? But they're used by Indonesians to be, people in the process of becoming Indonesians in the 1920s. I think that's the fascinating thing. I mean, the whole, it's quite mind-boggling for me. It's quite mind-boggling. If I was younger, I might go back and become a historian of the Dutch East Indies. But it's a fascinating thing. How does a new type of human come into being? Because from being a Javanese or a Sundanese or a Balinese to being an Indonesian, it's not simply a change of ethnic identity. You're becoming a member of a completely new community which has a completely different cultural base. It obviously also happened in Europe. Maybe we should have become. I think the same process. It's based on the analysis that nations are new things. That prior to, the Marxist analysis, which I think is the most convincing, is that prior to the rise of capitalism, there was no such thing as a nation. There were other forms of community that existed. And the interesting thing is, when a nation comes into being, it creates a new kind of person as well. Of course, the more challenging thing is that posed, among others, by John Lennon in his song, Imagine, you have to try and, what happens when you try and envisage that whole process that arises with capitalism, creating nations. After that. But I think in the contemporary world, for countries like Indonesia and Singapore is a bit more ambiguous example. The process of completing the creation and consolidation of what we now know is a nation is necessary, because in the current world, the question of equality between nations is difficult to achieve if it's without, if some communities which are nations are weaker than others, like in their own development as nations. So I think you can't say, I'm against nations, which I am. Therefore, countries like Indonesia should not try and complete the process of developing a consolidated nation, which includes things like, making literature more familiar to everyone and history more familiar to everyone and so on.
This is a follow-up on So you took the title of your book, Unfinished Nation, from Sukarno's statement about an unfinished nation. But I'm wondering, why not simply unfinished revolution? Because it seems that a reactionary, counter-revolutionary nation is a possible thing that can exist in the world.
I think a reactionary counter-revolutionary nation I think reactionary counter-revolutionary nations primarily can exist in the imperialist section of the world, like the United States or Australia or Western Europe. You could argue that in Indonesia since 1965, I would certainly argue that in Indonesia since 1965, you'd have a counter-revolutionary, reactionary state. But I think under the policies of that very reactionary state, the nation as a community has weakened. Because the policies carried out by the reactionary state, such as, no longer teaching literature in schools, falsifying history, and most crucially, not allowing people to organise, not having a role in determining their country's future, in a nation that's only recently been formed. A nation that's only recently, only 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, then it gains independence. It's still in the process of consolidating itself. When the reactionary state in Indonesia came into being and then stopped teaching literature, stopped teaching history, stopped allowing people to participate in politics, you actually start to weaken the nation. I think, for example, in language, regional languages, like local languages, Javanese and these, have gained in usage as compared to Indonesian language. Because on a day-to-day basis, what is there to talk about? If you're in a new country, 1965, you're still only 15 years since the Dutch left. You're in a new country and you're not allowed to talk about the future. That is, you're not allowed to talk about politics. So why bother? How does your Indonesian language become stronger and richer? What is there to talk about? So you talk about what? Household matters, day-to-day life matters. The local language, Javanese, Sundanese, that's adequate, very adequate, already very adequate for that. But to talk about the national future, you need a national language, because Javanese need to be able to talk to Achanese about national future. But if there's no discussion of the national future allowed, then the national language stagnates. Some of the early work by Ben Anderson on the over-formalization of Indonesian language in the 80s, it sheds some interesting light on that. But if you can't have a discussion about, if you're not allowed to participate in discussion, I think a different process applies in countries like Australia, the United States, where the desire to talk about the future is weaker so far, because everyone thinks the future is going to be the same as now. It's just, you don't have a future tense anymore, you just have present continuous tense. But in a country like Indonesia, where, if you tell, I said this yesterday also, if you tell the ordinary person in Indonesia is going to be like it is from now on, then that's not acceptable, because people are live under very, very backward, bad material conditions and bad cultural conditions. No one is satisfied with how things are. No one wants to think in the present continuous tense. And if you're not allowed to discuss the future, then... So I think you can have a reactionary national state, but a reactionary national state in a newly formed national community actually undermines the nation. If you have a reactionary national state, or in an imperialist country like the United States or Australia, I think it has different. Over time, it will also have erosive consequences, but of a different kind. So when the book first came out, many Indonesians would question me, why you think Indonesia's unfinished? I suppose you think Australia's a finished nation. Now I would say yes, but don't confuse the process of consolidating this new form of community nation with solving problems of civilization. So you have, a very consolidated nation, i.e. the United States, and, the outside observer at the moment are making many comments about what's going to happen to American civilization with the current scenario. I mean, having consolidating, you have a national language, you definitely have a definite US culture. As a foreigner who comes from another country and arrives and visits different US cities where there are differences, you can tell who's American, who's not. There is such a thing as a national culture and a national psychology, even though that psychology will have contradictions in it. You can tell. Us American comes to, I don't know whether you're familiar enough with the Australian character to be able to tell if you're meeting an Australian or not, but the American character is more well known throughout the world than the Australian character. I think the consequences are different for a conservative, a state that's mainly concerned about sustaining the status quo in a country like US, Australia. It also does become erosive. And one of the symptoms of the erosive long-term conservative state is that people do only live now in a present continuous tense. And if you live in a present continuous tense in the era of climate change, for example, you're courting disaster, basically.
Yeah. You mentioned yesterday, and I think many of us are familiar with these young to be historians who are writing now, like Asfi Barman Adam and Bambang Purwanto and Hilmar Farid before he joins the government. There is a development going on in Indonesia, and Arzamadi also is writing some very interesting stuff. So there really is a new generation of historians and people writing. But I just want to put forward something that's been, kind of left out of the conversation, which is the developments in Islam that are going on in Indonesia today, and the very active, rivalry that's been going on for a long time between the NU and the modernist organization, Muhammadiyah, and the way in which that conversation has been getting more sophisticated, deepening, and in an area that is not really limited in the way that the secular conversation, which I totally agree with you, has been limited for a long time. So, maybe bringing Islam into the conversation, is a way that young people have found that they can think about a future, and a very important future, in the world today.
I think it's absolutely true that there is there's obviously a section of society which not only identifies with Islam in general, but with the idea of an Islamic future for Indonesia, and that's certainly reflected amongst the youth as well. Now, I frequently speak on campuses in Indonesia, and after my talk, there will always be at least one or two people who put up their hands to speak, and as soon as you hear them speak, they're from Hizbut Tahrir.
Yeah, we're not talking about those guys.
So there's that component. Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, the two big mainstream institutions. I think for me, even though even though I'm based in Indonesia, I find following exactly what's happening in those two milieus as harder, more difficult and more difficult. The reason being, my impression is, because it's not area I sort of research into, my impression is that I wouldn't call it fragmentation, but there's certainly a, what do you call it? Increasing diversity about how people think. I mean, you get strange things like you can get Banzer, the Nahdlatul Ulama militia group, defending in some town a public discussion of what happened in 1965, which is presenting an alternative view. But then you can get the recent incident in Jakarta where a mob basically attacked the Legal Aid Institute, throwing stones and bottles, where the Persatuan Mahasiswa Islam Indonesia, the Islamic students organization associated with NU, is a part of the throne stowing. And that's actually been, that division has been there a long time. Actually, it was there before 65 as well. But now it's sort of like there's more different initiative. And Muhammadiyah is the same. On the one hand, you have a figure like Amin Rais, who still holds a senior position in Muhammadiyah, who aligns with, virtually almost aligns with Hizb ut-Tahrir, politically, not so, maybe not doctrinally, but politically. But then you get others who are not, the other, you get Sharif Mari, Sharif Mari, who's sort of more moderate, but you even get younger ones. So if you wanted to do a map of what's happening in those milieus, especially the younger age group, I think for me I would have to say the map's in flux. And I think what's stirring things up are the same things which are stirring things up everywhere. And what happens when a Muhammadiyah person or a young person or Nahdlatul Ulama person reads Pramoedya's books, where Islam plays no role in describing the origins of Indonesia? Islam plays no role. Even in Anak Semua Bangsa, where, which starts to open up, yes, there's Sarakat Dagang Islam, but in Jejak Langkah and Rumah Kaca, Footsteps and House of Glass, which describes the activities of Sarakat Dagang Islam, where is Islam?
But Menke in Footsteps, he is continually wanting to explore Islam and learn more about it. He recognizes that just as he didn't know his people in Child of All Nations, he doesn't know his religion. And Tirto was like that too. Tirto wanted to learn about Islam and deepen his knowledge. So,
but in the overall process, as I said, Tirto in the end fails. Yeah. And who are the next? Samaun. Yes, Haji Miswak. But it's Islam as a religion. It's not really. I mean, I once gave a talk in Jakarta at LIPI actually, and this one gentleman who was extremely hostile towards Pramoedya precisely because he's always against Islam. I mean, I could say to him, well, like you just said now, there was this, but also in This Earth of Mankind, a part of the argumentation for those defending Annalise was also that she was married under Islamic law, and that need to be recognised. So it's not like it's hostile to Islam, but in depicting all the social processes, religion does not, in Pramoedya's version at least, religion does not play a big role in the origin story. And if you read Arus Balik, of course, it opens up with a vivid depiction of Islamic, from the pulling down of Hindu Java statues and getting rid of them. So I think my own. This often comes up in discussions in Indonesia, and I think probably my view at the moment would be a minority view. But I think that the fundamental process in Indonesia now is a process of secularization. And that and that actually explains why there's also a more militant religious sector. The militancy of the religious sector, in this case Islamic groups, is a hostile reaction to what is fundamentally overall sociologically a secular process. Secular in the sense that on a day-to-day basis, to what extent does the ordinary person is the ordinary person inclined to appeal to supernatural force or think that supernatural force is playing a role in their life?
Well, we should ask Ulil there, because that's what he's doing his research on in East Java, I think. What have you found? Sorry to put you on the spot.
I'm still organizing my data.
Good cop-out, yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting contradiction because many people will comment, in Indonesia today, more women are wearing the jilbab. How does that match with the argument that things are becoming more secularized? I won't try to answer that now.
That's their choice. No one's making them wear that. That's their choice.
I'm not sure that there's not pressure.
Their mothers are not making them wear it. Let's put it that way.
Their husbands and brothers.
Maybe husbands and brothers, but not their mothers.
I think we have time for one more question.
Adrian, you had a question.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, so my question is, you were talking about transcendence, about how Japanese turned into Indonesian, Sundanese turned into Indonesian. My question is, how about the Chinese Indonesian? So, like, I think in Buru Quartet, my interpretation of the Chinese Indonesian, it was some kind of different microcosm than the natives, which might make a bit, which makes some sense because the Chinese were imposed under different rule under the Dutch, and they were also imposed with a different rules under Suharto. So, what I'd like, so how is your view about this transcendent of Chinese Indonesian? Are they fully Indonesian, and what is their role, in your view, in the Indonesian equation?
I think Pramoedya's book, Hokkien Indonesia, or the Chinese Indonesia, well, that was written in 1959, 1960, is quite a good introduction to this question. And it is more complicated than it is more complicated for the Chinese experience as compared to other groups. The basic fundamental process is the same, but it's made more complicated by the fact that from very early on, and this is also treated in the Pramoedya novels, but in this book as well, and many other books as well, that from very early on, those in power, so in the Dutch East Indies period, the Dutch colonial power, for various reasons, scapegoat Chinese in different contexts. I mean, there's a controversial statement made by the new governor of Jakarta a week or so ago, Anies Baswedan, about how, Pribumi natives, Pribumi Jakarta, are the ones who really felt the Dutch colonial power in Batavia. But of course, the single biggest massacre of Jakarta, of Batavia residents, was the Dutch massacre of Chinese. And it was the Chinese who the Dutch required to carry passports. It was the Chinese that the Dutch required to live in a certain area. Those rules, you must carry a passport, you must live in a certain area, did not apply to any other ethnic group in Batavia. So the Chinese in some ways were more oppressed in general, more regulated in general than other ethnicities. So that leaves a legacy of the Chinese being constantly targeted. Pramoedya wrote his book in 1959, 1960, as a critique of government policy then, which was discriminatory against Chinese. So his book is basically a defense of explaining the Chinese contribution, positive contributions to Indonesian history, and also critiquing the government policy towards. So it becomes more complicated because they're a group which have this history of being scapegoated. So that's a legacy which was still there in the Indonesian community after independence as well, and which led in 1959 to the government's policies then to ban Chinese from Indonesian Chinese from owning shops or businesses at the kabupaten atau kecamatan level. So all Chinese who wanted to open a shop had to move to Ibu Kota Provinsi, the provincial capital, and many Chinese left back to China as a result. So it is a more complicated thing, but the fundamental social processes, which Pramoedya describes at the beginning of the 20th century, I think with the qualification about them being scapegoated for various reasons by those in power, for the reasons that those in power had, has made this situation more complicated right up until today. And of course, in the 60s, this question also was a big division, because the Chinese, there were those Chinese on the left in organisations like Baperki who argued that, and Sukarno himself supported this perspective, that to become an Indonesian, you did not have to give up all your Chineseness. And the issue which symbolised it, of course, was the name, because there was a pressure. Chinese should not use the Chinese name; they should use the Indonesian name. And then Sukarno, in one of his speeches, made this quite important, and it was well reported at the time. Well, what's an Indonesian name? He's at a big rally, and someone said, you have to use Chinese should change to an Indonesian name. So he said, well, what's an Indonesian name? Should they change it to Simanjuntak? Should they change it to Warau? Simanjuntak, Batak name. Warau from Sulawesi. Should they change it to, Wayang Amerta, Balinese name? What is an Indonesian? He said, what is an Indonesian name? He said, and he had one of his cabinet ministers who was Chinese there, I forget his name. He said, why is Ong Hok Kam less Indonesian than Simanjuntak? These are all ethnicities. Indonesia, because of its composition, is made up of different ethnicities. So if you have all these ethnicities, what actually is an Indonesian name? Apa itu nama Indonesia? Sukarno says. In fact, what most Chinese have been forced to adopt during the Suharto era was Sanskrit names. Not from India. Fancy Sanskrit names instead. But of course you can't. Can Chinese actually change his name to Simanjuntak or Warau? It's not. Or they change the names to a Javanese name. But it's not. There's nothing more or less Indonesian about Ong Hok Kam than there is Suharto.
It's like a follow-up question. So you discussed about the Chinese condition in Dutch colonial era, and it's interesting when I read several Dutch documents about leprosy in the colonial era, and it was found that Dutch colonial blamed Chinese for spreading the disease. My question is, if Chinese were fair discriminated at that time, why the Dutch during 1921 until 1938 published had their guilders currency notes in 4 languages. So Dutch language, Japanese language, Chinese language, and Arabic language. I mean, if Chinese were very discriminated, then why Dutch still put their language as in the currency? I mean, it's like in currency, in my opinion, it shows that actually the Chinese still play a very big role in
The Chinese amongst the small retail sector in some import-export sector in Indonesia for a long time, the Chinese have played an important role commercially. But you can ask this, but that does not mean in other respects they weren't discriminated against. The same as under Suharto era. Many of the richest businessmen that emerged during the Suharto era were Indonesian Chinese. But the use of Chinese language, for example, on shops, etc., was banned. So there's not necessarily a contradiction between a section of a particular ethnic group, because most Chinese are not owners of conglomerate. Most Chinese are in Kalimantan farmers, or professional people, or very small shop owners. But it's not contradictory to be able to have an economic role on the one hand, and to be regulated against on the other. In fact, they often need to go together. Why did the Dutch massacre the Chinese in the first place, and then insist they have passports and live in certain areas? Because they were playing a significant economic role, and because they were playing a significant economic role, had to be controlled. So it's not contradictory to be playing an economic role on the one hand and being controlled on the other. Sometimes one group will want to control another group precisely because the other group is playing some kind of economic role, to keep that economic role within certain limits.
This has been a podcast from the Southeast Asia Center. Thanks for listening.